Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Pocket Dojo podcast, the show where we discuss making the world a better place by making better things. I'm Paul Crick.
And I'm Asha Singh. We are almost at the end of the first series of the Pocket Dojo podcast. I can't quite believe it. We'll be sharing 2 thematic episodes, let's call them, in May, while we prepare for series 2, but more about that later. Paul, what's in store on the show today?
So this week we're doing a recap of the last few episodes. In particular, we're looking back at what it means to lead today and what regenerative leadership practice involves.
Then the challenges that we've seen different organisations and kinds of teams face in the work that we've done with them, and some of our favourite frameworks for developing teams of the future.
Great, let's take a look.
So, leadership, what does it mean to lead ourselves and others, is a long discussed topic in and around all kinds of organisations. In 2019, Forbes magazine estimated that some $366 billion were being spent annually on leadership development of some kind around the world, whether that was formal learning or mentorship or self-study or whatever. And yet we still have all the challenges and indeed opportunities we see around us.
We've often thought about leadership as a series of qualities, skills, and tools that we need to develop and apply in right situations to get the results we want. The complexity and pace of change in recent years make it all too clear that we need to learn and adapt to changes as they're happening, instead of seeing things we don't want as problems to be solved, or that they'll go away once we've solved them and life can return to being stable enough.
Many of the assumptions we've long held about life and what we need to do in order to flourish are now out of date. Would be wise then to update our maps of reality so that we're able to better navigate what we find around us in the outer world. That means we need to make good sense of it individually and together through our responses in our inner world, what we might call our inner nature, so that we can make good decisions about what to do in response and then enact them. In other words, what we do together, what we change, how we organise, and how we get things done.
To know our inner nature means better understanding why we think and feel as we do, that much of our behaviour is learned as we move through life, and that perhaps the current situation we find ourselves in is asking us to actually behave in new, even unfamiliar ways. We're not born knowing how to take care of ourselves and flourish in the world. We have to learn what that means and then practice it. From being able to dress ourselves, to driving a car, to being in a happy relationship, we're constantly learning and adapting. That continues when we're leaders with positions of formal responsibility, where we often need to grow into those roles and then adapt as they evolve. Or in teams who want to work fruitfully and successfully together and may find it hard. We can learn to not just react to situations, but to creatively explore what is possible in them and where best to put our energy and resources. In other words, we practice emotional, relational, and spiritual intelligence. They're no longer just words in models we learn on a leadership program.
For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them, said Hannah Arendt, the American historian and philosopher who had a notable influence on politics in her time. Anyone who's ever had to create something new and innovate knows firsthand that this is true. Or anyone who's learned to ride a bicycle, drive a car, ski, play tennis, bring up children. In other words, perhaps all of us in different ways and situations. And as much as we might like maps or sat-navs or models to show us where to go and what to do, we're all experiencing more and more directly that the map is not the territory or that the model doesn't work in real life. At best, it might show us direction of travel. Often, it's just the wrong map or the wrong tool. Brief Thoughts on Maps, a poem by Miroslav Holub. The young lieutenant of a small Hungarian detachment in the Alps sent a reconnaissance unit out into the icy wasteland. It began to snow immediately. Snowed for 2 days and the unit did not return. The lieutenant suffered. He dispatched his own people to death. But the 3rd day, the unit came back. Where had they been? How had they made their way? Yes, they said. We considered ourselves lost and waited for the end. And then one of us found a map in his pocket. That calmed us down. We pitched camp, lasted out the snowstorm, and then with the map, we discovered our bearings. And here we are. The lieutenant borrowed this remarkable map and had a good look at it. It was not a map of the Alps, but of the Pyrenees.
It feels like a good place to start is to try and define regeneration. What does it mean in your view, Asha?
Well, I think actually regeneration means a lot of different things, Paul, to different people, in different situations, different places, etc. So maybe it's more useful to have quite a broad description of what it means to regenerate, because it changes from one context to another. Personally, I think regeneration is about creating the conditions for life to flourish, whether that's you, me, in our environment. It's all about people in place over time, how we learn and adapt together. I think it was in episode 4, we talked about taking a walk in a forest or another natural ecosystem where different species of flora and fauna live side by side. They're obviously both individuals of their species and part of that bigger group that is the species. Sometimes they are in symbiosis, so in other words, they cooperate, they're supportive of one another, and other times they're really competitive. You know, it's not all sweetness and light, let's say, in any kind of natural ecosystem. So obviously, you know, those that can flourish are the ones that can adapt as quickly and as well as possible as conditions in the forest change. Those are the ones that are going to survive.
So, what about technology and artificial intelligence?
So that's a massive topic, isn't it? And I can't
Yeah.
by any means, you know, claim to be an expert in any sense on either of those. But for me, technology should be an evolving set of tools that helps biological and social life to flourish, instead of something that is either, you know, controlling us or future proofing us in some way, which is often, you know, what people might want it to be. That obviously includes AI, which, as far as I know, and I, you know, again, I repeat, I'm not an expert by any means, seems to be currently focused mainly on achieving narrow goals. So, you know, in other words, how do you do something specific? You know, how do you, I don't know, have better diagnostic data for something, for example? It's not looking at the whole system that is health, let's say. You know, maybe this is a good topic to talk about in future episodes, as it's so, you know, important for us, and particularly thinking about the future. Maybe we can have some guests on that, you know a lot more about it than certainly I do.
So, what about regenerative practice? What kinds of things should we be thinking about?
I think there are several broad areas even of practice that can be really useful to consider. Firstly, perhaps, you know, the most essential is that we nurture our relationships. Even if we prefer to be alone or live alone or work alone, whatever, we obviously don't exist in a vacuum. We have relationships with each other and all the different contexts that, you know, we move through. And going back to that, the example, you know, of the forest, the natural ecosystem that we talked about in episode 4, as we move through different contexts, they shape us, and we shape them rather. Um, you know, we arrive in the present moment as the fruit of all of our experience and everything that's happened to us to date. And we're all different, you know, we're not the same or one as we often hear is the case today.
Yes, variety or diversity is the spice of life, as they say. It might sound like a no brainer. Why do you feel it's important to nourish our relationships?
Well, I think there are lots of reasons, you know. So we need each other, even if we're solitary, introverted, whatever. We're actually social animals. We don't all need to be really extroverted. Then there's too much that's going on in the world, you know, today. It's all too entangled, so it's all too connected, to make good sense of it by ourselves. So it's something that we really have to do together. And then obviously, when we work in an organization, we can't just do what the heck we like.
Well, relationships aren't just people in place, they're also about connecting dots between different things, aren't they?
Yeah, for sure. So, when we do that, it's possible to start seeing the patterns of thinking and behavior and therefore address them if, there's something that we think we need to do differently. For example, we've created largely organizations that want to grow, scale, and become robust so that they can weather, the frequent storms that seem to happen more and more often today. But that's not really a very wise way to develop resilience if we look to nature, or to be able to adapt when, we need to. So, for example, it's really important, really useful that we learn from people who have very different perspectives to ours. That can be really valuable, as hard as it might be in practice.
Yes, true. So, what else should we consider?
So, as we surface those patterns of thinking and behavior, those patterns that connect us, I think it's really important that we tell the truth about what we see, not what people want to hear, and that we make it the norm, make it the usual kind of practice to do so. So, we we seem to still have quite a lot of illusions about how nature works, so that, for example, we still believe we can have unlimited economic growth on a planet where what we use to fuel that growth, so the natural resources that we use, whether they're fossil fuels or materials that we use to make, all kinds of stuff, all of those resources are finite, and we're well aware that we're using them up at a much quicker pace than they can renew themselves. And then something quite different, but cancel culture isn't the answer either. So, just get rid of everything that's destroying the planet, or we don't like in our history, or people that don't agree with us, so that we can feel better about the world that we live in. To my mind, at least, and, I'm sure not just mine, but that feels like a really big projection of fear. And about the uncertainty of the future, which is understandable but not particularly helpful. And a lot of people also feeling really guilty about the present. They look around them and don't like what they see, and the part that's perhaps more difficult and most important that we address, kind of bring to the surface and do something about, is shame about the past.
I'd like us to focus in, though, on a smaller scale with something concrete that teams could use to learn and navigate the spaces between them.
So, as I've shared in previous episodes, I've done a lot of different work with different kinds of teams and organizations, and also in a few different countries. The second framework I'd like to introduce here is the distillation of all of that work really into what's called learning through doing. It's actually a process for developing collectively, and it's the name of my business. So, as you can see in the diagram, learning through doing consists of three parts: step back, go deeper, and experiment and refine. Now, it would make sense to start at 1 o'clock with observed reality, and then connect the dots, explore dynamics, see contributions, hold dialogue, elaborate purpose, signpost vision, way forwards, learn together, and create conditions for good things to happen. That would make sense, but in actual fact, you can start anywhere in this process. What's important is that we think about all these different things. So if I go to the elements, what that means, observing reality means that we're going to tell the story of what's been happening and our different interpretations of it. So I often work with teams and they start to elaborate the kind of narratives about their experience. They see both how different they are and how similar they are. In particular, once they connect the dots. So this is an opportunity to inquire why we're experiencing particular challenges, which rarely have a single cause. This helps us then to explore the dynamics that we're experiencing and illustrate, let's say, bring to the surface some of the thinking and behaviors that create those patterns. We don't do them intentionally, they just arise when we do certain things in certain ways. It would make sense then to go deeper and look at the contributions that we make to the reality that we experience. So it's not something that life isn't something that happens to us. we need to investigate how we make sense of the world and if that worldview or that narrative is still serving us. Then we can start to hold dialogue. So that means a deeper kind of conversation where we play with how to deepen the glue that holds us together. And this helps us to elaborate meaning, shared meaning, just not just you or I or other people, but something that we can bring forth that's really important for all of us moving forward. So in other words, a point of common ground. We then need to experiment and refine because we might have to do very different things in different areas, particularly if we're a big team in a multinational organization in different countries and different contexts. So we need to signpost what might be next. We can't necessarily see where to go in a complex environment, but we can identify some first steps to take together. We need to learn together. So we need to share what we're learning about ourselves, one another, and the world around us through this process. And only then, really, are we ready to create some conditions. We could call them simple kind of ground rules to agree on ways of working, governance, and business models that can produce the results that we want.
Very good. I can see how your process could be really for teams who need some breathing space to look at themselves and to see what to do differently. What kind of teams have found this approach useful, and what kind of challenges have you used this approach for?
Actually, most of the teams we talked about last time, Paul, so cross-functional, multifunctional teams, multinational teams rather, who need to get to know each other and develop trust, particularly when they're under pressure and working remotely or perhaps hybrid in different kind of locations. So they were also looking for better ways to collaborate from sometimes really different perspectives, rather than pulling in different directions and competing for what they perceive as perhaps limited resources or opportunities. So in short, they had to remember that they worked for the same organisation and agree different ways to approach some of the challenges. So that often means experimenting to see what works, and adapt as we go along. And then I've also worked with quite a lot of teams, actually, other words, teams who bring together other groups of teams from different departments in a big organization so that they can solve really complex challenges. That's what I think of as developing real collective leadership. So in other words, where leaders need to become enablers for whatever the group, requires, rather than driving their own functions to deliver something shared. So, not surprisingly, that's what a lot of senior people find really challenging, because it's all about establishing and maintaining relationships across a wide range of areas. And that can be quite difficult when you've spent, most of your professional life in the driving seat and chasing results. So it means creating conditions for good things to happen, which often won't be overnight. So in short, it's actually all about regeneration. Which frameworks do you use for developing teams or team coaching, Paul?
Well, I think it's interesting because as I listen to you speak, we do similar work and use different frameworks, but essentially they do the same thing. So one of the ones I use is a leadership circle collective leadership assessment. And what that is a litmus test that assesses how good do we work together as a collective, and how effective is our leadership in terms of achieving our goals. And essentially what we're looking at is we're looking at the creative structure. What are the creative structure of mind? What are the things that keep us to purpose and to vision? And what are some of the reactive tendencies we have? Some of the strengths that we overuse at times to try and control a situation, or to try and placate certain groups of stakeholders or other parts of an organization. This is really helpful because what that does is it looks at what is the culture that we have now, and what is the culture that we want to have in future. And what it does is it points to the gaps, or even where there are no gaps, it raises the question, so if there's no gap, what's the story that that's telling us? The reality is that, as you point out in the description of some of the work that you're doing, it's about the quality of conversation. The changing culture really comes from how we choose to tell the stories to ourselves and to each other. What are the patterns of language that we are using with each other, and how is that showing itself in our behaviors? What's good about that? What needs to change? And essentially, what I particularly like about it is there are some organizations that see the kind of work that we do as sort of light, fluffy, and a bit woolly and questionable, you might say. But I think that's an unfair criticism, because you've only got to look at the outcome and how people change, whether or not you use a data-driven approach like the collective leadership assessment, or we take an approach that is more intuitive, more creative, more emergent, and allows for things to evolve, like the learning through doing approach. So I think the conclusion I'm arriving at is that what matters is the conversation you have once you've done whatever it is you're doing, to say, what are the stories that we're telling ourselves? So that's one of the frameworks I like to use. In this episode, we thought about what it means to lead today and why we need to update our maps of reality so we can navigate what we have around us and what arises inside us because of
Yes, ways in which we can start to be more intentionally regenerative in how we lead ourselves and others, especially when things get difficult.
Then we shared some of our wide and deep experience with different kinds of teams and 3 frameworks for how we can develop teams more regeneratively in different ways.
I spoke about transform the collective and map for the terrain that many teams will have to face today, will need to cross. And also my process learning through doing for teams who want to step back out of daily life and reflect together on how they're creating the reality. It's not something that happens to us, so that they can agree what they might want to do differently in future in order to cross that terrain successfully.
And I described the Leadership Circle's collective leadership assessment for teams who want a data-informed approach to developing both themselves as individual and collectively, and what happens in the spaces between them as a result.
As we mentioned at the start of the show, this is the last episode in Series 1 of the Pocket Dojo podcast. Over the last few months, we've been finding our feet as new podcasters and our voice as co-hosts, and also introducing key topics for deeper exploration in Series 2 and beyond.
Preparing the ground and sowing the seeds, we could say. Series 2 is going to be about the spaces between us and the places we move through, which is where real regeneration can take place. We'll start the new series in June with our first guests in the Pocket Dojo.
It's really exciting. So each week, either Paul or I will be interviewing guests about their own regenerative practice and work, and what they've learned along the way that could also be really useful for you on your journey.
Yes, it is really exciting. We've got a fantastic group of guests lined up, and we'll be anticipating who they are and letting you know before each episode. While we prepare for Series 2, we've got 2 great episodes coming up in May, which thread together the main themes from this first series.
First, why leadership needs to change so that we can regenerate the natural world, our society and the economy.
And second, ways we can start to develop our leaders and teams in far more regenerative ways so that they can find their own voice and agency for the critical work of enabling all to flourish. Until then,
See you soon.
bye for now.